Jack the Ripper, the monster who vanished into history. London, 1888. The sky hung low with smoke, thick as grief, curling through the brick chimneys of a city on edge. Horses clopped over slick cobblestones. Street vendors barked over the choking stench of coal fires and human waste. Gas lamps flickered in the autumn mist, their glow barely reaching the ground before the fog devoured it. But in the East End, in a place the wealthy called God-forsaken, something darker than smoke was spreading. Whitechapel. It was a word that made proper society wrinkle its nose, a festering district of overcrowded tenements, drunken brawls, and desperation. The streets here weren't polished or patrolled. They were surrendered to disease, to vice, to hunger, to the forgotten. In Whitechapel, women disappeared, children vanished, and nobody asked questions, until one morning when a man named Charles Cross stumbled across a shape on Buck's Row. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags tossed in the street, but as he stepped closer, he froze. It was a woman. Lying on her back, her skirt lifted, her throat cut so savagely that her head was nearly detached. Blood pooled beneath her, sticky and still warm. This was not a robbery. This was not a drunken accident. This was hatred, focused like a scalpel. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, a woman lost to poverty, driven to prostitution to survive. She was 43, divorced, a mother who'd once had a home and a husband. She died alone in the early hours of August 31st. And in that moment, a ghost was born. The police arrived quickly but not carefully. They moved her body before photographing the scene. They washed the blood away. They didn't know it yet, but they had just bungled the first clue in a nightmare that would stain their city for centuries. Days later, it happened again. Annie Chapman, found in a back courtyard on Hanbury Street. This time, the killer had gone further, cutting not just her throat, but opening her abdomen, removing her uterus. It was done with precision. This wasn't a random frenzy. This was someone who understood anatomy, someone who wanted more than death, someone sending a message. And still, London slept uneasily. The newspapers caught wind of the story and ignited public hysteria. They gave the murderer a name, the Whitechapel Fiend. They printed every bloody detail, each more salacious than the last. Fear sold papers, panic filled the pockets of printers, and the killer kept reading. 2 weeks passed. Then another body. On the night of September 30th, 2 women were murdered just minutes apart, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Stride's throat was cut, but her body wasn't mutilated, likely because the killer was interrupted. But Eddowes? She was found in Mitre Square, and her body told a different story. Her face was slashed in a grotesque mockery of a smile, her abdomen ripped open, a kidney removed. The killer was getting bolder, more theatrical, and now mocking. A piece of Eddowes' bloody apron was found blocks away near a chalk scrawl on the wall. The U's are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. The police, terrified of igniting anti-Semitic riots, had it scrubbed away before dawn. They didn't even photograph it. Then came the letters. "Dear Boss," the first one began. It was written in red ink and sent to a news agency, mocking the police and promising more terror. It signed off with a name that would never be forgotten, Jack the Ripper. Within days, another letter arrived. This one came with half a human kidney and a note that read, "I fried and ate the other piece. It was very nice." Whether real or not, it cemented the myth. Jack the Ripper wasn't just a killer. He was a phantom in the fog, a story children whispered and mothers feared. Every man became a suspect. Every foreigner was glared at. The Jewish community of Whitechapel lived in terror, not just of the Ripper, but of being blamed for him. The press turned the murders into theater. They illustrated the bodies, mapped the crime scenes, and fed the fear like a furnace. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard scrambled, clueless, fractured, desperate. Detectives interviewed hundreds. They arrested drunks, doctors, and day laborers. They interrogated lunatics, lovers, and even members of the royal court. But no one could name the Ripper. He didn't leave footprints. He didn't leave fingerprints. No one heard him. No one saw him. And yet, when the mist settled, a woman would be dead, her body opened like a letter from hell. Then came November 9th. Mary Jane Kelly was young, just 25. She had red hair, a warm smile, and a room of her own on Miller's Court. Unlike the others, she wasn't killed in an alley. She was murdered in her bed, in her home. And the killer took his time. The police who found her were shaken. Her body was mutilated beyond recognition. Her face was flayed. Her heart was missing. Blood painted the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. The scene was more than murder. It was butchery. It was hatred. It was the act of a man who believed he'd never be caught. And he never was. After Mary Jane, Jack the Ripper disappeared. Just like that. No more letters, no more bodies, no closure. London was left stunned, bleeding, and silenced. The fog returned to Whitechapel, but this time it wasn't just mist. It was shame. It was fear. It was memory. People said he died or fled. Some believed he was rich and protected. Others believed he was a policeman, hiding in plain sight. Over 100 suspects have been proposed, from surgeons to princes to authors, but none confirmed. And yet the myth of Jack lived on. Not because he was clever, but because of what he revealed. His murders didn't just kill women, they exposed a society that had abandoned them. The Ripper's victims were forgotten souls, chewed up by poverty and spit out by the streets. No one listened when they cried for help. Only in death did they have names in the paper. Jack the Ripper murdered in shadows. But he held up a mirror to the world and showed them everything they didn't want to see. He was never caught, but he was never forgotten either. Not by the city, not by the world, and not by history. The blood had barely dried on Mary Jane Kelly's mattress before London began to unravel. Jack the Ripper didn't just end lives, he fractured trust. In the days after her murder, Whitechapel wasn't a slum anymore. It was a war zone. Doors were bolted, windows were boarded. Women walked in pairs, clutching knives or holy trinkets. Men lingered in corners, not to protect, but to whisper. Who was he? That question buzzed like flies around a corpse. The murders were over, it seemed, but the fear was not. It was as if Jack had retreated into the very fog that had once concealed him. Gone, but watching. The silence made it worse. There was no closure, no trial, no punishment. Just unanswered letters and mutilated bodies etched into the memory of a broken city. Scotland Yard, desperate to reclaim public trust, doubled their manhunt. Hundreds were interrogated, files piled high. Suspects came and went with the changing wind. But the truth was, the Ripper had already won. Not because he escaped, but because he had made the whole empire feel powerless. And then the rumors started. At first they were soft, a theory here, a whisper there, but they grew louder. Stranger. The idea that Jack the Ripper wasn't just a madman, but a man of importance, a man with power, a man who knew he'd never be punished. The public began to suspect a cover-up. After all, how could a killer so violent, so ritualistic, and so frequent simply vanish without a trace? Unless someone was helping him, unless someone was protecting him. The newspapers, which once printed tales of terror, now printed theories. And one theory screamed louder than the rest: the royal conspiracy. It began in the pubs, where rumors mixed with gin. They said Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, had fallen in love with a Catholic prostitute in Whitechapel, that he had secretly married her, that they had a child, and that the Ripper murders were part of a brutal cover-up by the Crown to silence everyone who knew. It sounded ridiculous, but the more the authorities denied it, the more people believed it. Some even claimed the murders were committed by the royal surgeon, Sir William Gull, who, stricken by order and royal loyalty, had killed the women and removed their organs as punishment for knowing too much. Sir Gull was never charged, but the legend stuck. Then there was the Freemason theory. Jack, they said, was part of the secret brotherhood, that the killings followed Masonic ritual, symbols carved into flesh, locations aligned with arcane maps, and the police, many of whom were Freemasons themselves, were quietly told to look away. Even high-ranking officers admitted they were overwhelmed. Inspector Frederick Aberline, the lead investigator, was haunted by the case until his death. Some said he knew who Jack was, others claimed he was silenced. The evidence? Circumstantial. The theories? Far-fetched. But in the absence of answers, conspiracy fills the void. And what about the suspects? There were many, too many. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher, intelligent, quiet. He drowned himself in the Thames weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. Some believed he was the killer, driven mad by guilt. Others thought he was framed. Aaron Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant with severe mental illness. He hated women. He hated prostitutes. He lived near the murder sites. He was even committed to an asylum. But he never confessed. And the evidence against him? Thin. Francis Tumblety, a quack American doctor who collected uteruses in jars. Yes, really. He was in London during the murders and fled to America soon after. Scotland Yard tried to bring him back, but the case dissolved. Walter Sickert, the famous painter, obsessed with the murders. Some believed his artwork hinted at first-hand knowledge. Others claimed he was just a man haunted by what he read in the papers. There was even a theory that Jack the Ripper was a woman, a midwife, able to walk bloody and unnoticed, carrying knives and wearing aprons without suspicion. If that were true, Jack would be Jill. And the world never saw her coming. The problem wasn't a lack of suspects. It was too many. The case was flooded. Evidence mishandled. Scenes contaminated. Autopsies botched. In some cases, police didn't even photograph the bodies before moving them. This wasn't just a crime spree, it was an institutional failure. But the public didn't blame the killer. They blamed the system. And then came the letters again. Not from Jack, but from the people. Petitions poured in, angry editorials, protests. They demanded change, not just justice for the murdered women, but reform, protection, sanitation, lighting in the streets, better wages for women, real housing for the poor. The Ripper had opened the wound, but now the people wanted to clean it. And in that way, Jack's shadow lingered. His murders sparked the first real conversations about how Victorian society treated its most vulnerable. Women like Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman had lived invisible lives, only becoming visible in death. Their pain forced London to look in the mirror, but even as change trickled in, something darker took root. Jack became legend. He wasn't a man anymore. He was an icon, a story told in whispers, in penny novels, on stage plays. The Ripper became entertainment, a silhouette with a top hat and scalpel, a Halloween costume, a boogeyman with branding. Tourists flocked to Whitechapel. Merchants sold Ripper tours. His victims became footnotes, and the killer, nameless and unpunished, became the headline. That, perhaps, is the real horror. Not just the murders, but the myth that followed. The way the world forgot the women and worshipped the mystery, the way evil became thrilling, the way the questions mattered more than the answers, and yet, no one stopped searching. To this day, people still chase Jack. Historians, writers, detectives, DNA analysts. They comb through the evidence, pore over letters, and claim new suspects with every generation. TV specials, podcasts, books. The Ripper industry never dies, and maybe it's because deep down people are still afraid, not just of who Jack was, but of what he exposed. That evil can walk among us, that justice doesn't always come, that pain, when inflicted on the poor, is easily ignored, and that the worst monsters don't always hide in caves or castles, but in cities, in crowds, in fog. Sometimes they write letters. The murders had stopped, but the obsession had only begun. Jack the Ripper had vanished like a ghost, leaving behind 5 brutalized bodies, a stack of letters soaked in red ink, and a legacy of fear so vast it seeped into the fabric of modern crime storytelling. He was never captured, never named, and in that absence, something even more dangerous was born. Fascination. By the winter of 1888, the public's fear had begun to twist. At first, the people wanted justice. They wanted the killer caught, hung, and buried. But as the trail went cold, their terror cooled into curiosity, and curiosity into hunger. People wanted to know, not just who he was, but why he did it. They studied the letters, the crime scenes. They dissected every mutilation like scholars. Jack had sparked the world's first modern true crime frenzy, and the press, smelling money, fed the flames. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Stage plays were written before the blood dried. Fictionalized tales of saucy Jack battling with detectives on foggy streets became popular theater. Even novels, barely disguised as nonfiction, capitalized on the hysteria. He was the villain that wouldn't die. And so, a strange transformation occurred. Jack the Ripper went from being feared to being followed. The media realized what they had created: the name, the image, the mystery. It was perfect. Jack wasn't real anymore. He was a brand, a character, and in many ways, the Ripper case taught the world a dark lesson. A killer who leaves a mystery is more powerful than one who gets caught. It didn't take long for the Ripper to become immortal. Decades passed. The world changed, but Jack stayed. He was the subject of the first crime books, the centerpiece of emerging criminology studies. Scotland Yard even began updating their forensics because of the public embarrassment caused by the case. In a tragic irony, Jack helped modernize policing. But while the science of catching killers evolved, the Ripper remained uncatchable. That only made him more fascinating. By the early 20th century, his name was being whispered in university halls and detective academies. Scholars examined the precision of the cuts. Was he left-handed, right-handed, tall? Did he have syphilis-induced psychosis? Was he suffering from PTSD? Or was he simply evil without explanation? Dozens of profiles emerged. Criminologists pored over every file, every morgue report, every grainy photograph of blood-soaked cobblestones. And every new theory brought a new wave of attention. And here is where the story becomes even darker. Jack the Ripper became the template. For what? For every serial killer that followed. He was the first to show how fear could spread without bombs or armies. He struck silently, then disappeared, and yet entire cities trembled. He wrote to the papers, demanded attention, and reveled in control. Sound familiar? The Zodiac Killer, BTK, the Monster of Florence. They followed his pattern. Some even admitted it. Copycats across time, inspired by a murderer who was never named. Even the term serial killer didn't exist until nearly a century later. But when it was coined, Jack the Ripper became the prototype. He wasn't the first serial killer in history, but he was the first to be famous. And fame, it turned out, was its own form of immortality. As the decades rolled on, the world only grew more obsessed. The 1970s brought a new wave of Ripperologists, private investigators, psychiatrists, novelists, all claiming to crack the case, all adding fuel to the legend. Television specials emerged. Books with bloody covers hit the shelves every year. And Jack kept selling, not just fear, but fantasy. He became a literary villain, an anti-hero, even a romantic figure in certain twisted retellings. That's when the myth truly mutated. In stories, Jack was given charm, sophistication, intelligence. He was imagined with a cape, a top hat, a grin. People forgot the victims, forgot the screams, forgot the broken bodies in the morning fog. Instead, they remembered the silhouette. Tourism exploded in Whitechapel. Guided tours followed his supposed footsteps. Tourists posed where Mary Ann Nichols bled to death. Souvenirs were sold. Jack's face, now stylized, adorned posters, mugs, T-shirts. And the irony? None of it was real. The iconic image of Jack, the dark cloak, the top hat, the surgical bag, was never seen by a witness. It was fabricated, built by artists, by illustrators, by sensational newspapers desperate for attention. But it stuck. And that imaginary silhouette outlived every fact in the case. The victims? They were flattened into footnotes. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. 5 women, poor, forgotten, hunted, and eventually erased beneath the legend of the man who murdered them. But in recent years, something has shifted. A new generation of historians has begun to dig deeper, not into the mystery of who Jack was, but into who the women were. Books like The Five by Hallie Rubenhold have reframed the narrative. These women weren't all prostitutes. Some were simply homeless, or sick, or cast aside by a society that failed them. Their deaths were not just acts of horror, but echoes of systemic cruelty. And in that reframing, we begin to understand the real legacy Jack left behind. It wasn't just murder. It was silence. It was the erasure of the poor, the voiceless, the vulnerable. Jack the Ripper showed the world how quickly a killer can become famous, and how easily the victims can become invisible. And even now, in the age of podcasts and Reddit threads, that imbalance continues. People still argue over suspects, over DNA tests, over the infamous "From Hell" letter, over which kidney was taken, and by whom. But few talk about the women, their lives, their dreams, their last moments. That is Jack's second crime. Not just what he did, but what we allowed him to become. A mystery that became myth. A killer who became a character, and a society that, in chasing his shadow, forgot to grieve the ones he stole. The world changed. The streets of Whitechapel filled with neon lights and tourists holding smartphones. But Jack stayed. Time couldn't erase him. Even when the city forgot its old kings and queens, it remembered Jack. His name remained carved in brick, whispered in fog, hidden between the cobblestones where blood once pooled. He had become something more than a man. He was a ghost with followers, and in the 21st century, those followers were louder than ever. They didn't wear badges. They didn't carry lanterns. They carried USB drives, DNA kits, high-speed internet. These new hunters weren't afraid of shadows. They wanted to shine lights into them. They believed technology could solve what time had buried. And for a moment, it looked like they might be right. It started with DNA. Forensic science had leapt forward. Blood could be traced, hair could speak, a cigarette could reveal a killer's face. And buried deep in the boxes of old evidence was a blood-stained shawl, said to belong to Catherine Eddowes, one of Jack's victims. The only one, some believed, whose killer left behind genetic proof. Researchers tested the blood, tested the semen, and then they tested the descendants of the victim and of a suspect long thought to be a madman, Aaron Kosminski. The results made headlines around the world. "Jack the Ripper identified," they shouted. The DNA, they claimed, matched. Kosminski, the Polish barber, known for his hatred of women and muttered threats, was the man behind the legend. He was poor, deranged, a ghost among the living, a man who had slipped through police fingers over a century ago. For a moment, the world gasped. Had they really done it? Had science cracked the code? Had the most infamous killer in history been reduced to strands of protein on a scarf? But as quickly as the headlines blazed, doubts poured in. The shawl hadn't been documented at the scene. There was no clear chain of custody. It had passed through collectors' hands, auctioned, stored, touched by dozens, if not hundreds, of people. Contamination was not just possible, it was guaranteed. Even worse, the DNA test was conducted by a businessman, not an official crime lab. The data wasn't peer-reviewed, the results were vague. The match? It was mitochondrial DNA, not unique to one man, but to thousands. The silence afterward was deafening. No retraction, no apology, just another headline fading like footsteps in an alley. Kosminski remained a suspect, but not the solution. Then came the confessions. Some were theatrical, others pathetic. In the early 1900s, a man named Frederick Deeming confessed to being the Ripper before his execution in Australia. He was already convicted of killing his wife and children. Why not claim more? In the 1920s, another man claimed he'd buried Jack's diary beneath his floorboards. Decades later, that diary surfaced, allegedly belonging to James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant. The diary read like a horror novel. It named names, described murders, even contained the phrase, "I give my name that all may know of me, so history may know me as Jack the Ripper." Explosive. Until experts noticed something odd. The ink was too fresh, the language too modern, pages missing. The man who found it couldn't explain why it had no record before 1992. It was most likely a hoax, but the damage was done. The myth had been fed again. In fact, it became clear that every few years someone would solve the Ripper case. They'd point to an obscure journal, a strange painting, a mismatched timeline, a hidden clue in a crime scene photo, always promising the same thing, the final piece of the puzzle. And every time, the truth stayed just out of reach. Why? Because Jack's greatest weapon wasn't his knife. It was the fog. Not just real fog, but the fog of history, the bungled investigations, the lost files, the evidence left in rain-soaked alleyways and unguarded morgues, the politics, the prejudice, the pressure. It all blurred the facts. And in that fog, even the sharpest minds lose their way. Some have argued that we don't want to solve it, that the legend is more powerful than the man, that if we name him, truly name him, he becomes mortal again. The mystery dies, the ghost crumbles, and Jack the Ripper becomes just another criminal in a long, dark line of violence, so we let him live. In TV shows, in comic books, in novels. He appears in Sherlock Holmes fan fiction, time travel thrillers, conspiracy dramas. Sometimes he's a genius, sometimes a demon, but always, always he escapes. The irony is unbearable. The man who destroyed 5 lives in back alleys has now outlived entire empires. His myth has been translated into every major language, his story taught in schools, his crimes staged in theater. And the victims? Still forgotten. Mary, Annie, Liz, Catherine, Mary Jane. We remember the cuts, the blood, the way their faces were mutilated, but not the women, not their voices, not their lives. They were real. They laughed, cried, loved, suffered, and for over a century they have been reduced to cautionary tales. And Jack? Jack became the main character. It's the final insult, and maybe the scariest part. Because when evil gets a name, it can be hunted, but when evil becomes entertainment, it wins. We watch documentaries with popcorn, take walking tours with cameras, dress as him for Halloween. We smile at horror and forget the horror was real. This is Jack's legacy, not just 5 deaths, but a blueprint. He showed the world how to vanish, how to make the truth slippery, how to turn pain into profit. And he did it all without ever being caught. That's what still haunts us. Because if Jack the Ripper could get away with it, who else has? He was never caught, never tried, never named. Jack the Ripper simply disappeared. And yet, more than 130 years later, we still speak his name with awe. Not because we admire what he did, but because we let the myth grow bigger than the truth. He was a butcher in the shadows, a sadist in the fog, a man who hunted the forgotten, tore them apart, and left behind no signature, only carnage. And somehow, we made him famous for it. We called him clever, brilliant, unstoppable. But Jack the Ripper wasn't a genius. He didn't outwit the world. He didn't escape because he was smart. He escaped because no one cared about the women he killed. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. Mary Jane Kelly, 5 women, 5 souls, not monsters, not myths, mothers, daughters, survivors. Each one crushed beneath the weight of poverty, addiction, illness, and a city that looked the other way. They screamed, and no one listened, until it was too late. Jack the Ripper thrived in that silence. He was born from it. He didn't just exploit their vulnerability, he relied on it. He knew that in Whitechapel, women disappeared all the time. He knew the police were overworked, underpaid, and more concerned with protecting their pride than protecting the poor. He knew the papers wanted blood, and he gave it to them. And we gave him immortality, because we love a mystery. We love the idea of a killer too clever to catch. We love the chase more than the justice. Jack the Ripper didn't vanish. He multiplied. He reappeared in every story where we forget the victim. Every time we make a killer the headline. Every time we turn a murderer into a movie star. Every time we glamorize the monster and silence the pain, he lives in the way we retell his story. In the tours, in the books, in the hashtags, in the false confessions and faked diaries and breathless documentaries that treat him like a legend instead of a lesson. And the lesson is this: Jack the Ripper wasn't special. He was ordinary, a man hiding in plain sight who got away with murder because the world didn't care about the ones he killed. That's the horror. Not the blood, not the knife, but the silence, the indifference. The way we let the myth swallow the truth and called it entertainment. So, what do we do with this story? Do we chase the mystery again? Build another theory? Draw another map? Or do we finally stop asking, who was Jack the Ripper? And start asking, why did the world let him exist? Why did no one protect Mary Ann before her throat was cut? Why did Annie Chapman sleep in a boarding house that threw her out for being short a penny? Why did Elizabeth Stride live in fear every night, only to die in a gutter with no one to hold her hand? Why did Catherine Eddowes smile one last time before walking alone into the dark? Why did Mary Jane Kelly scream and no one came? They were the story. They were the tragedy. They were the lesson we keep forgetting. Jack the Ripper? He was just a symptom. The real sickness is how easily we forget the ones who suffer when no one's watching. How we fail to protect the vulnerable. How we turn horror into theater and suffering into spectacle. Jack's shadow still lingers. Not in the alleys, but in our silence. In our obsession with evil. So long as it wears a mask and disappears like a magician. But he was real. And his victims were real. And they deserve better than myths. So tonight, when the fog rolls in and the streets grow quiet, remember this. The scariest thing about Jack the Ripper isn't that he vanished. It's that the world was ready to let him. This has been a story from Uncle Luke Tells. If this opened your eyes, don't just watch, remember. Like, subscribe, and share the names the world forgot. Because sometimes, the only justice left is being remembered.